was like a 5-year-old going to Hulk Hogan. That's just how big this man was.
For all you kids watching at home, Santa just is white.
Michelle Obama saying that museums are for white people.
Stopping black people more than white people. We're not executing people for crimes, but for violating the racial hierarchy.
The GI Bill has been earmarked for white veterans only.
All we've done is cut straight.
When I think about my own white privilege, I have to honestly say I got through K-12, I got through college, and my early 20s without really ever even thinking about it, nor was it ever brought up in curriculum.
The term white privilege was popularized in the late 1980s by researcher and author Peggy McIntosh, a women's studies professor who wrote an article that listed almost 50 examples of white privilege.
According to McIntosh, she has come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, assurances, tools, maps, guides, codebooks, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. If a person is not white, these unearned privileges cannot be counted on. Among her examples are instances such as stepping up in a challenging situation and not having to be a credit to her race, or being pretty certain that her skin color will be fairly close to the color of a flesh-colored Band-Aid.
White people can change their hair and, surprisingly, no one feels the need to touch it. And white people get to be on money, as if we don't see their faces everywhere else.
White people can have full-length arguments with cops. Are you out of your mind? Did you not see me out the light, you crazy son of a...
I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed.
When I go into a store, I know because of my privilege, my whiteness, I may not be followed like somebody or my colleagues of color.
Shopping while black.
She's been following me around the store the whole time. There she goes, she thinks I'm stealing.
If you're saying to yourself right now that racial shopping discrimination doesn't exist, chances are you're a white person. Barney's New York, to give just one example, has repeatedly been accused of mistreating black customers. In the case of 19-year-old Trayon Christian, undercover police officers arrested him when he walked out of Barney's with a $350 belt, despite having shown them proof of purchase. Heck, even Oprah can't avoid racial profiling. Last year, a Swiss clerk refused to show the media mogul a handbag, saying it would cost too much.
Another privilege is I can, financially, I can have access to banking. I can have access to buying a house in the areas that I might want to live in. I'm not discriminated against because of the color of my skin.
White privilege manifests in how the Social Security Act and housing played out in the early 1900s here in the United States. So the Social Security Act, in conjunction with Housing Administration Act, had BAs coming back from wartime and having the privilege of being able to have houses in suburban New York, Chicago, all over the United States. That was afforded to only white GIs instead of African American and Native American GIs coming back who had fought war. And the reality was that, that continuous, those GIs of color came back and were told, this program isn't for you, but we do have apartments, tenements, communities where you can live in close proximity, while all of our white GIs have new houses with new appliances and suburbs available to them. And it led to redlining, and it has led to the perpetuation of wealth for white populations that has not been afforded for communities of color. So that's just a minute example of how white privilege plays out in the United States.
When we think about financial benefits to whiteness, whites tend to have higher net worths than blacks.
Even with same credentials, my white privilege can oftentimes elevate me to getting a job over somebody who is not white.
What we did is we made up 5,000 resumes. Half of them we put an African-American name, half of them we put a white name. Otherwise, the resumes were the same. And we sent them out. And then we said, which got called back more? And what we found was that the same resume, when it had an African-American name, was about 33% less likely to get an interview than when it had a white name.
It means that if a white person is searching for a job for 10 weeks, an equivalently skilled African-American person would be searching for 15 weeks.
A young man who was walking with a group of, he was the only person of color, and he was walking across the street with a group of young men, probably, maybe 11 or 12 of them. He was the only person of color, and the police stopped only him as he was crossing the street, and he asked why, and it was because he was jaywalking. Yet all 12 of these young men were walking across the street at the same time, but only this young man of color was stopped by the police officer.
What happened? What happened? Just jaywalk. Oh, are you fucking kidding me right now? That's like racist. He's writing me. That's racist. There's like 300 people and you give him a ticket for jaywalking?
I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is.
A new study by researchers at Stanford University indicates that those who want to deny that white privilege exists do so by maintaining that they have gone through some significant obstacles in their lives. So the subjects in the study were separated into two groups. The group that was shown evidence of white privilege claimed more hardships than those not exposed to evidence of privilege. Okay? So despite this reality, according to the researchers, policymakers and power brokers continue to debate whether racial privilege even exists and whether to address such inequity. One reason for this inaction might be an unwillingness among whites to acknowledge racial privilege, acknowledgement that may be difficult given that whites are motivated to believe that meritocratic systems and personal virtues determine life outcomes. The biggest issue is people don't know what white privilege means, right? So people interpret that as, oh, I didn't actually earn anything in my life. I didn't actually deserve the things that I got in my life because of this ridiculous made-up notion of white privilege. But that's not what it is. All it's saying is you have gotten the benefit of the doubt in certain cases, right? So if you're being pulled over by a cop, for instance, if you're a white person, you're less likely to be deemed as a threat as opposed to a black person.
White privilege, for me, in terms of how I see it, is the systems set in place that give white Europeans unearned privilege. So this idea of just because that my skin color is white, I come from that ethnicity, heritage, whatever we want to call it, that I have unearned privileges based on the color of my skin over somebody else.
The system of white supremacy is designed to be invisible, such that one is often not even aware that that particular system exists.
Our buildings of higher education, our banking, all of those structures are very white spaces.
It's hard for most whites to see their white privilege because white privilege is basically the practice of giving whites the benefit of the doubt and a bit of leeway. It's the practice of granting them a second chance, treating them with understanding, and offering sympathy and empathy during difficult times. It's going that extra mile to make sure that white outcomes are pleasant. And when whites have been treated this way by other whites for generations, it's difficult for them to see these actions as advantageous because it's just the normal way of doing business. Most are too busy receiving white privilege perks to notice that people of color aren't treated the same way. Most are blinded to the notion that blacks and others not only aren't given the benefit of the doubt or afforded second chances, but also are frequently treated with suspicion and receive harsh penalties for first-time infractions.
Read out one by one.
Guilty. I don't like to send anybody to jail.
Judge Jerry Baxter requested that most of them be handcuffed and removed from the courtroom immediately.
They have made their bed and they're going to have to lie in it.
There is a privilege that we hold to believe that we can come into a community of color and tell them how to make themselves better.
When I say that there's comfort in white privilege, if I can go to any sort of banking institution and get a loan for anything that I would need a loan for, a home, a car, money to go on vacation, I mean, why would I want to share that with other people? If the history of my group and the accomplishments of my group are touted in educational settings and reinforced in media and reinforced in the movies, why would I want that not to dominate the airway? You know, I think that when you're interrupting the status quo, you think very deeply about how is that going to impact my own personal power and privilege? How is that going to impact the power and privilege of the racial group I occupy?
When asked if white privilege was real, many everyday African Americans and some whites were pretty sure it wasn't imaginary and gave specific examples on how it operates.
White privilege in America was present since the start of America. The founding fathers were all white and young, and most of them were rich. White privilege was a way of life for America, and much of it exists today, I would say, yes.
It exists, and some of my people are so used to it that to them it's the norm.
There certainly is. It's the obliviousness of the power and privilege that's been provided from the fallacy that got created generations ago when white Europeans came to the United States and claimed land that was not their own and came up with categorizations of populations of human beings to designate who should have power and who shouldn't, who should do what work and who shouldn't. And that fallacy, created by von Linnaeus and many other scientists that were believed to be honorable men, are the unfortunate foundation of this country that gives power and privilege to Caucasian individuals that has not been afforded to communities of color for generations.
In all areas of life and living in our beloved country of America, then I would say white privilege and racism permeates. And that would include education, the health, the criminal justice system, all areas that I can probably think of, employment, economics, every area. And that's simply because the black race and other races, non-white, are coming from a deficit. We're coming from a behind. This country was built on white privilege and slavery of black people.
All the power that's been invested throughout history has all been held by white people, and so that's just, led to generations and generations of power being passed down from the original, white people to, their descendants.
Yes, there most certainly is. It's a true fact that there is white racism or white privilege.
Why do you say that?
Well, it's totally obvious and stuff in, the climate of the state of Minnesota. We're last to be hired, first to be fired. And, having the privilege of being able to, if there's a problem, to go to the boss and say, that black guy over there is having a problem, when in fact it was the white guy that had the problem, but the black guy loses his job. That I would consider to be white privilege.
White privilege definitely exists, especially in the state of Minnesota, where there are not a lot of people of color. White people are given the ability to do whatever they want. They can go into any establishment, ask for a manager. There is no problem. Their kids can do whatever they want in whatever restaurant. There is never a problem. But as soon as my nephews, 2 of them, go into a restaurant, they're looking and making sure that they're not stealing anything or trying to be disruptive. It is a huge systematic problem, definitely in Minnesota. And I am very uptight and sick with it, but it is an ism, it is in Minnesota. And unfortunately, I have to teach my daughter that even though she is a bright, attractive, intelligent young lady, there is a huge difference between her and a blonde-haired child. And that's because there is white privilege that exists.
Oh, absolutely.
Why?
I mean, I've been born and raised here in the city of Minneapolis, and I've been here 46 years, and I have worked in a system for over 17 years that has shown me that there is white privilege. I was a law enforcement officer for many years. It can manifest itself in which way for, like, say, police community relations, where disproportionately more African Americans are being stopped than white.
Going into just basically like a Walmart store and walking around because I'm trying to find maybe bread or milk and being followed, or being asked if they can help me, but there's someone else in the store, white, and there's no problem with that at all. She can walk around and ask for stuff, pick up stuff, try it out, and it's fine. But as soon as I try to do that, it's a huge problem, and I need to be helped, because otherwise if I'm not being helped, I'm probably trying to take something that's not mine. Not okay.
I can remember being pulled over by police for no specific reason given. I can remember several times seeking loans when my credit score wasn't bad and being denied.
When I was in graduate school, my graduate school professor spent most of his time with his white male students and just kind of left me to figure things out on my own. He did not really invest anything in me. I was just someone he had to deal with, as opposed to someone he had to teach.
Well, I mean, African Americans have only been free for such a short time, so, property ownership and a lot of other things, whites had it in the beginning. They are the dominant race in this country, and so a lot of things were established years ago, and it continues.
Because it manifests itself in systems and processes that are designed to make things better for the majority population, but to keep the minority populations down. And I believe that it is a part of being American, and that a lot of people that are white don't even realize that they get some of their benefits as a result of white privilege.
The signs are here all around. They've been here ever since we came to these shores. It has been white privilege. You can look at the building down the street. It said the Department of Justice, which is the federal courthouse, but they, me and you know that it's just us. And that means just white folks. Okay. And when you go in there, you can look to be doing some time if you're black.
Media is controlled by white power, white money. And that means that more often than not, the white perspective of race is something that gets more airtime, if you will,
Maybe there should be a campaign to discourage pot use among minorities, to say that, there's a better way to make it in your future and to take better care of your body.
So many of these people, almost all of them that we see, are so poor and they are so black.
The fact that in 2014, police will instantly associate blackness with criminality. And much of the media is doing nothing more than perpetuating that same ridiculous stereotype. Check this out. After the shooting, news outlets were airing photographs of Brown wearing his high school cap and gown, remarking that he was only days away from starting his first semester in college. But by the time more outlets picked up the story, this photo was circulating around, showing Brown in a sports jersey and suggesting that the boy might have been a gangbanger. Unsurprisingly, in response to this blatant race baiting that the news media uses to drive their narrative, the Twitter community came up with the hashtag #IfTheyGunnedMeDown, posting pictures of themselves on social media and asking which picture the news media would likely use if they were gunned down by police. In this tweet, Ben Valence asked if the media would portray her as a gangbanger or a classy lady. And here, a user posts a photo of himself in a U.S. Army uniform alongside a selfie of him holding a toy gun, asking if the media would use the pic on the left or the one on the right if he were gunned down.
Is he going to get a fair shake, this officer?
There has been a rush to judgment.
Eric Holder flies into Ferguson, with his superhero cape.
This mantra of the unarmed black teenager shot by a white cop, that description in and of itself actually colors the way in which we look at this story.
Yes, describing the actual facts of the case really does color the way we look at it. White cop shoots unarmed black teen does sound terrible.
A lot of people are trying to make this, Dana, about black and white and trying to make this about race.
This is part of this effort to make it everything about race.
Is this a story about race? Do we know that?
I think it is playing the race card, and I think it's disgraceful.
The only racial divide that is created here is being created by the race baiters.
You know who talks about race? Racists.
It is, it is uncomfortable. I don't know. I sometimes you feel like it's hard to say anything right.
Kimberly?
Right?
You've got to be inclusive. You can't sit there and say, I'm just addressing one group. And I think it's very insulting to say, well, white people don't understand it. What are you talking about? You're part of the problem then if you're casting dispersions that way and speaking and labeling all white people, saying that they don't understand the issue or they can't relate to it. That's really not giving people much credit, isn't it? I mean, and that's what you're complaining about to begin with, yet you're making the problem by putting other people down and putting people down by race or putting people down by gender. Like, open your mind.
We're in an impossible situation. If you come up to us and say, well, there was slavery in this country 220 years ago and white people did it and I hold you responsible, what do you want me, Melissa, Greg, and Kimberly to say?
Everybody in Cleveland, low minority, got Obama phone. Keep Obama in president, He gave us a phone.
Gave you a phone?
More.
How did he give you a phone?
You sign up if you on full stamps, you on Social Security, you got low income. Keep Obama in president.
4 murders in 11 days. A judge decides Nico Jenkins is responsible for all of them.
Nico Jenkins was released from prison early after serving only half his sentence. The head of the Omaha Police Union said Jenkins is the poster child for why the good time law is a farce.
I told you were too close, but nobody ever listens to me. No. I mean, who does that? Backs a car into another car? You know what? You make my head numb. I can't even. Ugh.
Does Santa really work in the North Pole?
No, he don't work. He lays on the couch and he drinks all day. He's trifling. I have to pay all the bills. He kind of like your mama. Now, bye.
I mean, certainly I think the media is one of the primary conveyors of misinformation and stereotypes related to various groups of people, and we see this on our morning and our nightly news. One example that I would highlight is typically when a person of color commits a crime, the race of that person is revealed, neighborhoods are revealed, very personal information relative to the person, the alleged person that is committing the crime. That information is very hyper visible. In fact, oftentimes I will see actual pictures or sketches of individuals based on the racial group that they occupy.
The media is both a reflection and a projection of white culture. So naturally, like all other institutions in America, it's racist. Media owners and producers treat white lives as standard, as important, as valued, and as relatable. Media outlets present white experience as universal and as a baseline from which all experiences are measured. On the other hand, those who control the media treat non-white lives as other, marginal, not valued, and certainly not relatable. The media also imposes a double standard in which negative actions that whites commit are often met with understanding, sympathy, and forgiveness, whereas the same negative actions that people of color commit are met with scorn and condemnation.
What I'm trying to say is that after particular sporting events, students riot too often. They burn cars, they loot, they hurt police officers. You know the term we use for those riots? College students. That's what we call them, college students, not thugs.
In the end, 9 people were killed, 18 others injured, and 170 suspects arrested, all of them being held on $1 million bond. But even as the story is unfolding, some insist that because the bikers are not black, media is covering the story differently than they did the violence in Baltimore.
I can imagine this. Imagine if the story just broke and nobody knew exactly who the participants were. You might hear somebody using the usual routine. And there's destruction and violence in Waco. We want to find out the role of fatherlessness among those combatants and rioters, the role of their music, the role of what was that? They're white. Well, bikers. It was a melee.
I do want to go over the terms you were mentioning, because an article in Salon points out some of the terms being used by media. You got CNN using terms like melee, ruckus, fracas, brawl, fistfight, brouhaha. Who uses that term? Issues, trouble, and chaos. Then you have the New York Times saying shootout, chaos, fight, confrontation, and problems. They don't say brouhaha. We need to work it into our repertoire more often. But none of them, the point from Salon says they never use the word riot. But the truth is, in fairness, this was not a riot. It was a shootout, it was obscene violence, but they weren't rioting, they were murdering each other.
Funny how the media covers white riots versus black protests.
Breaking news.
Seems like when the protesters are black, the media uses some pretty harsh words.
The bad guys. Lawlessness, looting,
wild animals,
criminals, and thugs.
Thugs. Isn't it the right word?
However, if you're white and you're tearing up the city because of a game, you're just young people.
Young people danced on a flipped-over car.
As UK fans did stupid things.
Some maybe got a little out of control.
Seeing a scene like this just shows how passionate the UK fans are.
It's so tough to lose, and unfortunately the ugly side that we sometimes see in sports.
Sometimes they don't even call a white riot a riot.
Party gone awry.
Some fans got a bit too rowdy after the win.
If we want to look at TV shows, if we want to look at newscasters, predominantly, I think it's still very white.
I think daily, especially here in Atlanta, if you look at the news almost every day, there's a murder. And the people that they choose to put in front of the camera, you know, for the, I guess, local color or, you know, the person on the street interviews, you know, very stereotypical people had no teeth or, you know, not speaking correct English, that sort of thing.
Well, obviously we have a rapist in Lincoln Park. He's climbing in your windows. He's snatching your people up, trying to rape them. So y'all need to hide your kids, hide your wife, and hide your husband because they're raping everybody out here.
I mean, well, when we look at media or entertainment, it's often not an accurate reflection of kind of the diversity of the African American experience. So when you look on television, I mean, there are sort of these typical tropes that you see in terms of black characters that are presented on television. So when you think about sort of the typical stereotypes associated with blackness, with, you know, black males, one of those, you know, typical stereotypes is that of sort of the black buck. So that's the person who's sort of highly, you know, masculinized, very sexualized, has sort of this insatiable sexual appetite, is often irresponsible. So these are sort of the types of characters that you often see played out in you know, television. So I mean, these are, you know, these sort of caricatures of blackness that sort of pervades society. So there is sort of this skewed view of what it is to be an African American in this country.
So when, our generation growing up, if there was a black person in a movie, they were going to, be sure to die before the end of the film. So I think, that, scenario gives people, because a lot of people in America treat what they see in the media as real, even if it's fiction or totally silly. They try to, conflate that with history or reality in certain ways. So that scenario of the black guy dying off first, or, being susceptible to drugs or violence or, criminality, conveys messages to people who are viewing that content. And, if you have a wide range, if you're, hopefully better educated, or you have other options, or you see your parents doing more positive things, you can counterbalance those media images. But I know a lot of our young people don't have that, balance of exposure.
So we know that typically when a person of color goes missing in this country, there's very little media attention being paid. We often find out about it through independent channels within our community or our local African American newspapers. However, when a white woman goes missing, it becomes national or even international news. We see round-the-clock coverage. When a white woman goes missing, we see people trying to investigate, going out trying to figure out what happened in that situation, trying to find the killer. And what it demonstrates is the fact that we still see white women as being on a pedestal in our society, as though their lives are much more valuable than the lives of just about any other group of people outside of white men. It sends a message when a black woman goes missing that our lives aren't really valued, that we really don't matter in this society. And it definitely feels as though our humanity doesn't matter at the end of the day. The media, whether intentionally or not, perpetuates these messages that certain lives are valuable in comparison to other lives.
Well, I think all of our images that we use in media are still very white. Even if we have, I even think about models, even our models of color generally are chosen because they have more white characteristics.
Self-concept and self-esteem. Now, you can look at the media and see silly white people, in sitcoms or whatever, but the difference there is that they also have a wide range of positive and, uplifting images. But for groups like African Americans or other racial groups, it's frequently you only have the stereotypical or disparaging images out there for young people to, view and, see as role models. So that's why when you talk to a lot of young blacks, our primary role models are athletes or hip-hop artists and that sort of thing, instead of, a wide range of political aspirations and career options.
When you're constantly being exposed to these images of black people that really aren't necessarily positive images or representative of the total experience of what it is to be African American in the country, then yes, it definitely can have an impact on your self-worth and self-esteem.
So here we have Daniel Day-Lewis and Tom Cruise in Last of the Mohicans and The Last Samurai. So what does that say? Or even what does that say about how our community of colors are always portrayed? Asians are always martial artists. Latino men are always gang members and from the barrio, and African Americans, males too, part of the gangs in the prison system, leading roles, all of that type of thing. But I think also what that kind of portrays to, or a side shoot of that, is that idea that it is oftentimes, it's going to be the white person that comes in to save a community.
Cold weather endurance is vital to building a successful sled team. Haven't seen you guys in a week. Thought maybe you got lost on your way to class. Wanted to help you find your way back.
People heard that you were just playing with 2 strings. Some of them thought you might want something better to work with. I can't cover that. It's a gift.
The moment those 3 kids disappeared, it was news.
The moment the 3 civil rights workers disappeared, it was news.
Did you smile when the bulldozer ran over the black kid's body?
What's wrong with these people?
An unarmed man arrives home to his wife and 3 small children, gets out of his car, and with his back turned, is gunned down by a coward. The person who pulled the trigger and ended the life of Medgar Evers is this defendant, Byron De La Beckwith. My car's been vandalized, my son's been in a fight, and I've been called every ugly thing there is by every racist in the state of Mississippi. Think that this one trial's gonna magically change all of this?
It's a step.
Why do I have to take that step so that some sick lunatic can murder my wife and my children?
Someday they're going to be able to tell their children that it was their daddy who put away the man who killed Medgar Evers.
Are you very sad, Jimmy Dolan? A little. I disappoint you, maybe. Well, you're not exactly what I expected.
They've sent us a message that they can take whatever they want. But we will send them a message that this is our land.
You said to write about what disturbs me, particularly if it bothers no one else. I'd like to write something from the point of view of the help. I want to interview you.
Leah, is this another one of your charities?
We need to find out more about his past.
He's been enrolled in 7 different institutions. His grade point average begins with 0.
He needs to do better in school.
I'd love to work with him.
This is mine?
Yes, sir.
Never had one before.
What, a room to yourself?
A bed.
So we're constantly bombarded with this image of the white savior in our society. And that image is perpetuated often through the media and in movies, where you have a community of color, particularly an African-American community that's in distress. Maybe it's socioeconomic distress that community is facing. Maybe it's challenges within the public education system. And you have a white person who comes on the scene, who realizes that there are problems, and who winds up taking on the system or helping to bridge the gap on behalf of that community. And then the media basically hails that person as a hero, as though they have come into the community and they have saved the people and they've turned people's lives around. And that white savior trope that permeates throughout media and throughout different movies that we watch ignores the fact that there is a system of white supremacy that's in place that makes it so that those communities are in distress in the first place. If we didn't have a system of white supremacy, there would be equal access to opportunity. There wouldn't be communities in which the public school system is underfunded, where kids don't have access to high quality teachers or even decent textbooks or access to resources. We ignore that within the context of this white savior image that's being perpetuated. And we say, oh no, there are these poor people over here in need of someone to come in and rescue them. And again, it ignores this entire system that's been put in place that perpetuates these inequities within the system. I have a huge problem with that because it also ignores the fact that there are African American heroes who go into these communities day in and day out and roll up their sleeves to work on behalf of the community and to work alongside of the community, who often live in the community and whose contributions are ignored within those communities. That to me is something that needs to be addressed, that we need to adjust our lens in terms of recognizing the value that people of color hold within their own community, and to stop placing these so-called white saviors on a pedestal. I think about the fact that institutions have been designed and created with certain types of people in mind. So if you look at K through 12 education, for example, I would argue that our entire system of K through 12 education has been designed to benefit white children in the United States. And folks may disagree with that, but the reality is that from the days of slavery, it was a crime for African Americans to learn to read, to learn to write, and to actually get an education. And we saw that once our people were allowed to get an education, that systemic barriers were put in place to deny us equal access to educational opportunity, such that you had lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and others who had to champion the cause of equality within public education for African Americans and other children of color by pushing for integration within our public school system. We know that the Supreme Court said that separate schools are inherently unequal because of African Americans being denied equal access to books that were decent in terms of quality, even facilities that they had to attend to go to school, that they were not equal to the facilities that white students had access to. And then just the educational experience and what types of resources are available within the public school setting. So African Americans were denied access to an equal education from the point in time in which it became legal for African American children to get an education. And so when you think about the fact that the public education system has been designed to benefit white children and their access to an education, then obviously some people are going to suffer the consequences of not fitting the mold of being a white middle class kid. And they are going to continue to experience negative effects of a school system that has not been designed with them in mind and for their benefit. And that's what we're seeing today.
Our band teacher was laid off about 2 years ago, and our room has been empty ever since. Our instruments are locked away and uniforms just hanging.
A performing arts program with no performing arts teachers is an oxymoron.
Bring the easel up. Normally we have our reading lesson in the back, but because they did that $2 shoddy cover up on that pipe, I'm still scared to go back there. And I teach first grade, and I don't have reading books.
Now they don't bring books home, and everything is Xerox copy. They're little kids, they don't take great notes, so without books, it's a problem for the parents to help.
We don't have any ink, so a lot of times I have to do this at home. It takes a lot of my preparation time, and we only have 2 preps a week, and it's totally unfair. Our kids love to learn, they're eager to learn, and they deserve better.
So a lot of the funding for local schools comes from housing taxes and property taxes. And so that's why you can go to a school in this neighborhood in the West End in Atlanta, and it looks like a prison in, the shadows of the 2 domes that we have here in Atlanta. And then you go to the same county, North Fulton County, and, up near Roswell, and the high schools and middle schools look like college campuses. They have better resources than you'll see here in the Atlanta University Center frequently. And, that's a function of property taxes, but the inequality and the long-term effects of that can be devastating on young people.
Examples of education are, who actually makes it into the literary canon. I mean, when I was really surprised to see that many of the readings that my children have been required to partake in are very similar to some of the readings that were assigned to me, and I graduated in 1991. You do see a few more women, you see a few more women of color, but in my eyes, it certainly is not inclusive.
I think, white dominance in education is probably one of the most, prolific and destructive aspects of white dominance. So here at Spelman we have a course called African Diaspora in the World, and one of the reasons we fought for implementing a course like that is because we think people need to know that their worldview, their culture has value. So instead of a Eurocentric pattern, we try to center Africa in the course content. So it's not to exclude Europe, but a lot of our educational system is focused on European history, European reality, European life stories. So it's, permeates our educational system. And, that's why you have things like Black History Month and, certain aspects of Black history or Latino history, any other history that's incorporated into our education, but it's primarily centered on Europe, European perspectives, European literature. And I think that's problematic because we know the world is more diverse than, just Europe.
And so I think oftentimes our students feel invisible because there are no mirrors that they get to see themselves in the curriculum.
Standardized tests are not based on what people of color traditionally experience in this country. It's from a white, mainstream, middle-class perspective in terms of how the tests are written, in terms of a lot of the context that's within the test and the information that's there. And so if you have not grown up in a white, mainstream, middle-class environment, it's going to be challenging to understand the context for the information, but yet you're judged on the same playing field as a white, mainstream, middle-class person.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems with white supremacy in education is that the experience of Black people in this country tends to get eliminated. So often white people have no idea of the contributions that Black people have made to the country. So most history books refer to Black people as being slaves. There was a civil war, slavery ended, and then we had civil rights, and this man named Dr. King helped Black people get equal rights, but that's kind of the extent of the story that most people have. So they don't understand that Benjamin Banneker was the person who was responsible for surveying Washington, D.C. I mean, he was largely responsible for the construction of our Capitol. I mean, he was one of the most brilliant minds in the country, but people don't really know that there are all of these amazing African-American minds who really contributed to the structure and fabric of the country. So when people don't understand that history, then they're more likely to believe the, lie that Black people really, are lazy and ignorant and haven't really contributed anything to society and are, draining society and are a burden, and that makes it easier for people to embrace that philosophy of white supremacy.
Whites don't like to talk about history. We're frequently told as Blacks, you talk about racism, why don't you get over it and move on? But history is important.
So the psychological capital that whites get is that they really have done everything that's worth doing in the country. So when you look at the founding fathers, the history of Black people who fought in the Revolutionary War, Black people who served as intelligence officers that really helped cinch the victory of the American forces in the Revolution. All of that sort of gets erased. I mean, there was a Black man who rode with Paul Revere during the Midnight Ride. So I mean, all of those things are really erased from history. So when that happens, white people do assume that they are responsible for building the country, when that really isn't the case. And when that gets erased for Black people, we get robbed of really the knowledge of, the contributions that we have made outside of slavery. So a lot of Black people assume that, we were slaves and, nothing else. So when you don't understand that sort of rich legacy and that rich history, you do sort of internalize these beliefs about inferiority or beliefs about, whites being superior and somehow more deserving of the privileges that are extended to them just purely on the basis of skin color.
I was saying that's what makes America so different. That these several myths that most white Americans live by, the whole founding fathers myth and how the flag was made and George Washington never told a lie and all that kind of stuff is what keeps Americans from understanding America.
Part of the other issue that we face is the fact that most Americans have not been taught our history. We've been taught revisionist history. So in other words, the folks who are writing the textbooks and marketing the textbooks do not include the whole truth within those textbooks. People are just getting snippets of the truth, bits and pieces of the truth, so that when, as people of color, we raise concerns about historical inequities and the racism and discrimination that we face, people look in mainstream society and say, well, what are you complaining about? Things weren't as bad as you're articulating. And what I've learned in history, it wasn't so bad. We know that, again, those are falsehoods that are being perpetuated, and it makes it very difficult for people to acknowledge the fact that we have not come as far as we like to say that we have.
Now, in the U.S., new studies on the diversity gap have found that fewer than 20% of public school teachers are non-white, while almost half of the students are from minorities. The Center for American Progress and the National Education Association says 82% of the 3.3 million teachers in the U.S. public elementary and secondary schools are white. The report said Hispanics account for 8% of the population, while African Americans are dragging behind, that is, by only 7%. It added that despite programs to increase the number of minority staff, the yield of new teachers of color is disappointing.
I think in the St. Paul school system, only 4% of our teachers are teachers of color. That's huge.
Another area where white dominance is prevalent in keeping opportunities for balanced education to come forth is how students of color, primarily black and red students, are channeled in K-12 schools to special education because they're not getting along well with teachers that are predominantly white, predominantly women, and for the most part filled with unrecognized blind spots on how they see the behavior of black and red kids similarly to the behavior of white kids.
Within the educational system, African American children do tend to be unfairly targeted in terms of when we look at suspension rates, for example, or disciplinary actions, black students do tend to have a disproportionate amount of suspensions in comparison to non-African American students for similar offenses.
It all started when a Spring Valley High School teacher told the student to leave the classroom. She refused. That's when the deputy gets called in and things quickly escalate. Students we talked to say he has a history of aggression. Some reportedly even call him Officer Slam.
This morning, this now viral video of an arrest at a South Carolina school is sparking community outrage. The confrontation all caught on tape, showing a police officer approaching an unidentified female student at her desk Monday. Watch as the officer grabs the girl's arm, then wraps his own arm around her neck, slamming her and her desk to the ground.
I mean, so when you look at, the incident in South Carolina, for example, so this officer essentially assaulted this young girl for refusing to follow directions. But when you look, closer at her history and closer at her story, I mean, it turns out that she's, in the foster care system. So it's unknown, what level of trauma this girl has experienced to be separated from her family and placed in foster care. So when children have had those early experiences, it does really influence behavior. It influences, the way that they relate to other people in the world. And when the educational system doesn't have any understanding of how those areas impact behavior, the tendency does tend to be to kind of criminalize children for behaving in developmentally appropriate ways.
A lot of times we look at the disparities in public education and we call it an achievement gap. Well, I argue that there is no achievement gap. There is an opportunity gap within public education, meaning that having inadequate access to opportunity is going to affect the type of school that you attend, the quality of the teachers who teach you, the credentials that they have, the quality of the facilities and books and other resources that you have access to. And we know that within our poorest communities, there is a lack of equal opportunity with regard to education. That is structural and it is systemic. It is by design. It's not the fault of the children. It's not the fault of the parents. It's not the fault of their community. It's the fact that we have an unreconciled racial history in this country that continues to permeate our systems, that continues to impact the way that we do business in this country, who benefits from the way in which the system is structured, and who is denied access to opportunity.